A gun pressed against her temple, two men unconscious on the floor, and the only man who could save her was bleeding wounded, holding a revolver he couldn't fire because if he missed by half an inch, the woman who saved his life 7 days ago would be dead. But Alara was not helpless, and this story was not going to end the way the last one did. It all started with blood on snow and a woman nobody invited. Caleb Hawthorne stood in the middle of his cabin, blood running down his left arm, where the old scar had torn open again. In front of him, Jasper Slade held Alara by the wrist, the barrel of a Colt revolver pressed against her temple. Two of Slade's men lay on the floor, one unconscious, one groaning, clutching a wounded hand. The air smelled of gunpowder and crushed herbs, sharp and wrong, like a church that had caught fire. Alara looked straight into Caleb's eyes. She did not cry. She did not beg. Her voice came out steady enough to stop a man's heart. "Shoot," Slade laughed. A quiet-mannered laugh, like a man who had heard a decent joke at a dinner party. "You hear that, Hawthorne? Your bride wants to die." Caleb said nothing. His hand tightened around the revolver. His eyes measured the distance, calculated the angle. He knew that if he missed by half an inch, the woman who had saved his life 7 days ago would be dead before the sound reached the walls. Just like Thomas. Just like that night 3 years ago when the snow turned red and his brother's eyes went glassy and still, while Caleb held him and screamed into a darkness that did not care. But Alara was not Thomas, and this story was not going to end the way the last one did. Not if Caleb Hawthorne had anything left to say about it. This is how it all began, not with gunfire, not with vengeance, but with blood on snow and a woman nobody invited. 7 days earlier, the stagecoach pulled into Silver Creek, Colorado at 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in February of 1882. The sky was the color of old iron. Wind came down off the Rockies carrying the kind of cold that doesn't ask permission, just walks straight through your coat and sits in your bones like it owns the place. Alara Whitfield stepped down from the coach with one suitcase in her left hand and the rest of her life packed inside it. A few dresses, a leather pouch containing a set of suturing needles, 2 rolls of catgut thread, and a pair of surgical scissors wrapped in oilcloth. A book on herbal medicine so old that the binding had cracked and been re-glued twice. And a letter. The letter was short. Written in a strong hand but clumsy, the letters pressed too hard into the paper, as if the man who wrote them was more accustomed to holding a rifle than a pen. It was not a love letter. It did not contain a single word of affection or even basic courtesy. It read more like a contract. He needed a woman to manage the cabin and the daily work of living on a mountain. She needed a place to disappear to. No promises of love, no vows of devotion. Just a transaction between two people who had run out of better options. The man who had written that letter was named Caleb Hawthorne, and when Alara asked about him in Silver Creek, the reaction was immediate and unanimous. Fear. Martha Henderson, the woman who ran the general store, looked at Alara the way a doctor looks at a patient who has just been told something terrible. Half pity, half dread. She set down the jar she had been shelving and came around the counter, wiping her hands on her apron, studying this young woman from the east with her honey blonde hair already coming loose from its pins, and her amber brown eyes scanning the small town like she was trying to decide whether it was a refuge or another kind of prison. "Hawthorne," Martha repeated as if the name itself tasted sour. "You came all the way from Boston for Caleb Hawthorne." "I did. He hasn't come down from that mountain in 3 months. Maybe 4. Lives up there like a wild animal. The last people who tried to visit him came back white as paper and wouldn't say a word about what they saw." Martha paused, lowered her voice. "Sweetheart, are you sure you know what you're walking into?" Alara did not answer the question directly. She could not afford to because the honest answer was no, she did not know. What she knew was this: in Boston, her father had signed a document giving her away to a man named Silas Pemberton. Pemberton was 58 years old. He was heavy in the way that spoke of excess rather than labor. He had a reputation for cruelty toward the women in his life, and Alara's father owed him a debt that could only be paid in flesh. Not his own, of course. His daughter's. The wedding had been set for a Thursday morning. Alara left on Wednesday night with the money her mother had hidden before the consumption took her, the money her father never found sewn into the lining of a winter coat Margaret Whitfield had worn every day of her last year on Earth. Alara cut the lining open with her mother's sewing scissors, counted the bills, bought a stagecoach ticket heading west, and did not look back. She had found Caleb's advertisement to in an old newspaper at a way station in Kansas. Man seeks wife, mountain cabin, Colorado territory, must be willing to work. No frivolity. That was all. No description of himself, no mention of romance, just those blunt, graceless words, and somehow they were exactly what Alara needed to read. A man who wanted a partner, not a decoration. A place so remote that Silas Pemberton's money and lawyers would never reach. She wrote to the address listed, received no reply, wrote again, nothing. Kept heading west anyway because west was the only direction that did not lead back to Pemberton's house and the life her father had sold her into. By the time she reached Silver Creek, she had accepted that the advertisement might be years old, that the man might be dead, that she might arrive to find nothing but an empty cabin on a frozen mountain. Any of those possibilities was still better than what she had left behind. Martha Henderson studied her for a long time across the counter. Then she shook her head slowly and said almost to herself, "She doesn't know about the brother. Someone should tell her." But nobody did. The only person in Silver Creek willing to take Alara up the mountain was a man named Edgar Finn. He was 67 years old. He walked with a limp from a mining accident that had crushed his left ankle 11 years ago and healed it at an angle that made every step a negotiation with pain. He had a face like a dried apple, all wrinkles and sharp edges, but his eyes were bright and quick and missed nothing. Edgar was the only person in town who was not afraid of Caleb Hawthorne. He was also, as far as Alara could tell, the only person who did not hate him. They set out at first light the next morning, Edgar driving a mule cart loaded with supplies. The trail up the mountain was steep, narrow, and treacherous with ice. The mules picked their way along the edge of drops that fell hundreds of feet into pine-filled canyons. Alara gripped the seat rail and tried not to look down. Edgar talked as he drove. Not constantly, not the way nervous people talk to fill silence, but in measured portions, like a man rationing water in the desert. He gave her pieces of Caleb Hawthorne one at a time. He was the best bounty hunter in the Rockies, maybe the best west of the Mississippi. Federal marshals would send for him when they had a man too dangerous for anyone else to bring in. Caleb would ride out alone, no posse, no backup, and come back with the man. Dead or alive, depending on how much fight the man had in him. Alara listened. The wind bit her cheeks and numbed her fingers through her gloves, but she did not ask Edgar to stop or slow down. She needed this information the way a soldier needs a map before entering unknown territory. 3 years ago, Edgar continued, something happened. Don't know exactly what. He won't say and I won't ask, but he quit. Just quit. Rode up this mountain, built that cabin with his own hands, and shut the door on the world. Hasn't let a soul in since. But he placed an advertisement for a wife. Edgar grunted. That was 3 years ago, right before whatever happened. I reckon he had a moment of wanting something normal, something human. Then the thing happened and he forgot he'd ever wanted anything at all. 3 years. The advertisement was 3 years old. The newspaper she had found it in was a back issue discarded at a way station, pages yellowed and curling. Caleb Hawthorne had written those words in a different life before whatever broke him had finished the job. Alara looked at the trail behind them, the trail that led back to Silver Creek and eventually to Boston and Pemberton's house. Then she looked at the trail ahead, steep and white with snow leading up into clouds that sat on the mountains like a lid on a pot. She did not ask Edgar to turn around. One more thing, Edgar said, and his voice changed. Lost its conversational ease and took on the weight of genuine warning. He's not a bad man. I've known Caleb since he was 22 and fresh off a cattle drive from Texas. He's not cruel, not vicious, but he's like a wounded bear right now. Most dangerous thing in these mountains. You corner him, crowd him, push him before he's ready, and he'll come at you with everything he has. Not because he wants to hurt you, because hurting is the only response he has left. Alara thought about that for a long time. Then she said, I've lived with dangerous men before Mr. Finn. The difference is the dangerous man I left in Boston wanted to own me. The dangerous man on this mountain just wants to be left alone. I can work with that. Edgar looked at her sideways. Something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. The look one survivor gives another. All right then, he said. Let's go meet your husband. And they heard it before they saw the cabin. a sound that stopped Edgar's mules in their tracks and made Alara's blood go cold. It was a low guttural noise, half growl and half groan, and it could have been an animal or it could have been a man in the kind of pain that strips away everything civilized and leaves only the raw machinery of survival. Edgar pulled the cart to a halt. His weathered face went pale. The cabin was visible now through the trees, a solid structure of pine logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch that faced the valley below. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney on a day this cold, but there was none. The front door was wide open, hanging at an angle that suggested it had been thrown open with force rather than opened with intent. And there was blood on the snow. Not a little blood, a trail of it dark and vivid against the white leading from the tree line across 30 feet of open ground and through the cabin door. Something had been dragged, or something had dragged itself. Alara was off the cart before Edgar could stop her. She heard him call her name, heard the alarm in his voice, but she was already running, her boots crunching through the crusted snow, her skirt hiked above her ankles so she would not trip. She reached the porch and followed the blood trail through the open door into darkness. What she found inside would have sent most people running back the way they came. Caleb Hawthorne lay face down on the floor of his own cabin. One arm stretched out toward a table he had not reached, the other tucked beneath his body. He was enormous. That was the first thing she registered. Even collapsed, even broken, the man took up more space than seemed possible. Shoulders wide enough to fill a doorframe, legs that went on forever, hands like shovels, thick-fingered and scarred across every knuckle. His hair was dark brown, shot through with gray at the temples, longer than was respectable, matted with sweat and blood. He wore a thick flannel shirt soaked through on the left side, and below it his left thigh was torn open in a wound that made Alara's stomach clench even as her training kicked in and began cataloging what she saw. 3 deep lacerations running parallel across the quadriceps muscle, tissue torn, not cut, consistent with claws or teeth, bleeding heavily, the blood pooling on the plank floor in a dark mirror that reflected the gray light from the open door. Beside him, sprawled across the threshold between the main room and what appeared to be a small back porch, lay the body of a gray wolf. It was massive, easily 100 pounds, with a thick winter coat matted with its own blood. Its throat had been cut, a single savage wound delivered by the hunting knife that still lay on the floor where Caleb had dropped it. The wolf's eyes were open, glassy, fixed on nothing. Its lips were pulled back from teeth that were still red. The man had fought the wolf. The man had killed the wolf. But the wolf had torn him open first, and he had been lying here bleeding since God knew when, and if someone did not stop that bleeding, soon the wolf would have its revenge from beyond death. Alara knelt beside him, pulled off her gloves, reached for his throat to check his pulse. The moment her fingers touched his neck, his eyes snapped open. They were the color of a winter sky just before a storm. Pale blue-gray shot through with something colder, something that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the kind of man who looked out from behind them. Those eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that went beyond assessment. This was a predator's gaze, the look of something that had survived by knowing instantly and without error whether the thing in front of it was threat or prey. His hand shot out, fingers locked around her wrist. The grip was crushing, strong enough to grind the small bones together, strong enough to make her gasp. He held her there immobile while those storm-colored eyes searched her face for answers to questions he had not yet spoken aloud. "Who?" he said, and each word cost him. Each syllable was pulled from somewhere deep and reluctant, dragged out through a throat that had gone dry with pain and blood loss. "Who let you into my house?" Alara did not pull her hand back, did not flinch, did not look away from those wild, dangerous eyes. "I'm Alara Whitfield," she said. Her voice was steady. She made it steady. She had learned that skill in Boston in Pemberton's drawing room, where showing fear was the same as showing weakness, and showing weakness invited the worst kinds of attention. "I'm your bride, and you are bleeding to death on your own floor, so you need to let go of my wrist and let me save your life." He stared at her, this small woman with snow melting in her honey-colored hair and a face white with fear, but eyes burning with something that was not fear at all. Something closer to fury. Something that said she had not traveled 2,000 miles across a frozen continent to watch a stranger die on a Tuesday afternoon. His grip loosened. His hand fell back to the floor. He managed. Didn't order any bride. That advertisement. 3 years ago. I know. Alara was already pulling scissors from her suitcase, already cutting away the blood-soaked fabric around the wound. The newspaper was old. You never replied to my letter. You probably never even received it. None of that matters right now. What matters is that you have 3 deep lacerations on your left thigh that are bleeding faster than your body can compensate, and if I don't close them in the next hour, you will die. So lie still, stop talking, and let me work. Something flickered across his face. Not gratitude, not yet. Closer to bewilderment, the expression of a man who has been alone so long that the sound of another human voice giving him orders is as foreign and disorienting as birdsong in winter. He lay still. Edgar appeared in the doorway, breathing hard, the climb having cost his bad ankle more than it wanted to pay. He took in the scene. The wolf, the blood, the small woman from Boston already on her knees with surgical scissors in her hand. Hot water, Alara said without looking up. As much as you can heat. And find me clean cloth, anything. Sheets, shirts, flour sacks, anything that hasn't touched the floor. Edgar moved. Alara worked. She washed her hands with whiskey from a bottle she found on Caleb's shelf. Cleaned the wound the same way, pouring alcohol over torn flesh, while Caleb's entire body went rigid, every muscle locking down his jaw clenched so tight she could hear his teeth creak. He made no sound. Not a groan, not a whimper, nothing. Sweat broke out across his forehead and ran down his temples, but his hands simply found the leg of the heavy wooden table and gripped it until the wood groaned under the pressure. She threaded her needle. She had done this before. Florence Ashby, the midwife who had trained her in Boston, had taught her wound suturing on pig carcasses. First, then on the living patients who came through the charity ward with knife wounds and factory injuries. Florence had been a tiny woman with hands like a watchmaker and a voice that could calm a screaming child from across a room. She had taught Alara that the most important thing about treating a wound was not the technique, it was the ability to focus, to narrow the world down to the wound, the needle, the thread, and nothing else. Not the blood, not the screaming, not the knowledge that the person beneath your hands might die despite everything you did. Alara focused. She closed the first laceration with 12 precise stitches, the catgut thread pulling torn muscle back into alignment while blood welled up hot and dark around her fingers. Caleb's body shuddered once, a deep involuntary tremor that ran through him like an earthquake, but he held still with a discipline that spoke of a lifetime of enduring things that should not be endured. She talked while she worked, not because she needed to, but because he needed to stay conscious, and the sound of a human voice was a rope she could throw him, something to hold on to while the pain tried to pull him under. She told him about the stagecoach ride from Kansas, about the woman who sat across from her for 300 miles and knitted the same sock the entire time without ever finishing it, about the snow on the passes, how it lay on the mountains like a white quilt pulled up to the chin of a sleeping child, about Edgar's mules, and how the one on the left kept trying to eat the other one's ear. Caleb did not respond, but his eyes stayed open and they stayed on her face, and that was enough. The second laceration was deeper. Alara had to use the forceps to hold tissue in place, while she sutured her hands slippery with blood, her fingers aching from the cold that crept through the open door. She asked Edgar to close it. He did. The cabin grew warmer, darker, the lamplight making their shadows dance on the log walls like something out of an old story. When she reached the third laceration, the worst of them, Caleb's breathing changed. It became shallow, rapid, the breathing of a body approaching its limits. His skin had gone from weathered bronze to a gray that Alara did not like. "Stay with me," she said. 3 more stitches. "Been through worse." The words came out slurred, distant. His eyes were losing focus. "I doubt that." Alara tied off another stitch. "Hold on. Not going anywhere." A ghost of something that might have been dry humor buried under layers of pain and exhaustion. "Can't exactly walk." She finished the final suture and sat back on her heels. Her hands were shaking. She had not noticed them shaking while she worked, but now that the immediate crisis was past, the tremors came rolling through her fingers and up her wrists and into her arms, until she had to press her palms flat against her thighs to make them stop. The wound was closed. The bleeding was controlled. The stitches were clean, and even the kind of work that Florence Ashby would have nodded at, which was the highest compliment Florence ever gave. Caleb's eyes found hers, that unreadable gaze again, half surprised, half something deeper that she could not name and was not sure she wanted to. "You know what you're doing." Not a question, an observation, delivered with the flat precision of a man accustomed to assessing capabilities both in allies and enemies. "I learned from the best." Alara reached for clean bandages. "Now you're going to drink this willow bark tea and sleep. In the morning, if you're alive, we'll discuss the fact that I am here and have nowhere else to go. But tonight you're my patient and you'll do what I tell you." He looked at her for a long time, a man who had not taken an order from another human being in 3 years, staring at a woman half his size who was covered in his blood and telling him what to do in a voice that did not waver. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and closed his eyes. Edgar stayed the night. He slept in the old armchair by the fire, his bad ankle propped on a stool, his snoring filling the cabin with a sound so mundane and human that it almost made Alara smile. Almost. She did not sleep. She pulled a wooden chair beside the pallet where Caleb lay and watched him through the darkness, monitoring his breathing, checking his pulse every 30 minutes, her trained eye cataloging the signs: skin color, respiration rate, the steadiness or unsteadiness of his heartbeat beneath her fingertips when she pressed them to the vein in his neck. At some point after midnight, while she was checking his bandages, her lamp held close to the wound, she noticed something on his left forearm. A scar, long and straight and old. Not from the wolf. This wound had healed years ago, leaving a raised white line that ran from his wrist nearly to his elbow. It was the kind of scar left by a blade, not claws. A knife or a sword wielded with force and intent. She did not ask about it, not yet. But she filed it away in the part of her mind that collected facts and waited for the right moment to assemble them into understanding. Near dawn, Caleb began to speak in his sleep. His voice was different. Stripped of the gravel and the guard, it sounded younger, raw, like a door had opened in his chest and something unprotected had crawled out. He was not speaking to her. He was speaking to someone who was not there. Someone named Thomas. "I'm sorry," he said. The words came out broken, cracked down the middle like a stone that had been struck too many times. I should have been. Thomas, don't go. Don't go like Thomas went." Alara sat very still in her chair. She watched this enormous, dangerous man thrash in his sleep, fighting an enemy that could not be killed because it lived inside him. She watched his hands clench and unclench on the blanket, grasping for someone they could not find. And she understood with a clarity that settled into her chest like cold water that whatever had broken Caleb Hawthorne, whatever had driven him to this mountain and this silence and this slow, deliberate dying, had a name: Thomas. She did not know yet who Thomas was, did not know what had happened or why Caleb carried it like an open wound hidden beneath clothes. But she knew the sound of grief. She had made that sound herself 5 years ago in a narrow room in Boston that smelled of camphor and approaching death, holding her mother's hand while Margaret Whitfield's breathing slowed and stuttered and finally gently stopped. In the gray light before dawn, Alara discovered one more thing. Beneath Caleb's bed, pushed against the wall where it would be hidden by the hanging blankets, there was a wooden chest. Small, perhaps 2 feet long, made of cedar that still faintly smelled of the tree it had been. The chest was locked with a simple brass padlock, the key nowhere visible. She did not try to open it. She respected privacy. It was one of the things Florence had taught her, along with suturing and herbal tinctures and the proper way to set a broken bone. People have rooms inside themselves that they keep locked, Florence had said. You don't pick those locks. You wait until they hand you the key. But Alara noticed something. When Caleb woke briefly an hour later, groggy and disoriented, the first thing he did was look toward the bed. Not at her, not at the door, at the bed. When he saw the chest was still there, still locked, something in his face relaxed by a fraction so small that most people would have missed it entirely. Alara did not miss it. She filed that away too. Edgar left the next morning. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, his lined face pulled into an expression that was equal parts worry and admiration. You saved his life, he told Alara. He owes you for that. But don't expect gratitude. Caleb Hawthorne forgot how to be human a long time ago. I'm not looking for gratitude, Mr. Finn. What are you looking for? Alara considered the question. Behind her in the cabin, Caleb Hawthorne lay unconscious on a pallet, his body broken, his soul in worse shape than his leg, his entire existence a monument to a grief she did not yet understand. Before her, through the open door, the Rocky Mountains stretched in every direction, white and indifferent and enormous. "A home," she said. "I'm looking for a home." Edgar looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat on, nodded once, and climbed back onto his cart. "I'll be back in a week with more supplies. If he gives you trouble, remind him that I know where he hides his good whiskey." He drove away down the mountain trail, the mule cart creaking and swaying, growing smaller against the white until it vanished around a bend, and Alara was alone. Alone with a stranger, alone on a mountain, alone in a cabin that smelled of blood and wolf and the sharp pine resin of freshly split wood. She closed the door, latched it, turned back to face the room. "All right," she said to nobody in particular. "All right," and she began to clean. The next 3 days established the pattern of their war, because that was what it was, a war. A siege, more accurately, with Caleb defending the walls of his isolation and Alara methodically, patiently, relentlessly undermining them. He did not want her there. He made this clear through every available channel of communication. He refused to eat the food she cooked, though she could see his nostrils flare when the smell of hot broth filled the cabin. He turned his face to the wall when she came to change his bandages, as though by not looking at her, he could pretend she did not exist. When she spoke to him, he answered in single words or not at all, his jaw set in a line that dared the world to try reaching him. The cabin itself was evidence of how thoroughly he had abandoned the project of being alive. 3 years of solitude had reduced it to something closer to a den than a dwelling. Dirty clothes piled in corners, food scraps rotting on surfaces, dust so thick on the windows that the light came through gray and defeated. A fine rifle hung on pegs above the fireplace, cleaned and oiled, the only object in the cabin that had been cared for. Everything else had been allowed to decay, as if Caleb Hawthorne had decided that maintenance was a form of optimism, and optimism was a luxury he could no longer afford. Alara cleaned anyway, not because he asked, not because she was trying to impress him or domesticate him or any of the things that a mail-order bride was traditionally expected to do. She cleaned because filth was a symptom. Florence Ashby had taught her that too. When a person stops caring for their environment, they have stopped caring for themselves. The mess was not laziness. It was grief made visible. And grief left untreated was as dangerous as any infected wound. She scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees, washed the windows until light came through clean and sharp, organized his supplies, aired out blankets that smelled of sweat and sleepless nights. She worked in silence, not asking permission, not seeking approval, simply doing what needed to be done with the same focused efficiency she brought to suturing wounds. Caleb watched her from his pallet with eyes that burned like cold fire. She could feel his gaze on her back while she worked, could feel the hostility in it, but also something else. Something that was not hostility at all. Something closer to confusion. As though he was watching a phenomenon he could not explain and was not sure whether to fear or marvel at. On the second day, she changed his bandages. This required touching him, kneeling beside his pallet, unwrapping the soiled cloth from his thigh, examining the wound with careful fingers. The stitches were holding. No signs of infection. The flesh was angry and swollen, but that was normal for a wound this severe. It would heal. Given time and care, it would heal. When her hands touched his skin, Caleb flinched. Not from pain. His body recoiled from the contact itself, a sharp, involuntary jerk, like a man who has been struck and is bracing for the next blow. Except he had not been struck. He had been touched. Gently, carefully, with hands that knew the difference between treatment and harm. And in that flinch, Alara saw everything she needed to see. Not a wild animal, not a dangerous beast. A man. A man who had been alone so long that the simple act of another person's hand on his skin was a shock his nervous system did not know how to process. A man who had starved himself of human contact until the hunger had become so deep he did not recognize it anymore, had mistaken it for preference, for choice, for the way things should be. She finished the bandaging without comment, did not mention the flinch, did not say anything that might make him feel exposed or ashamed. She simply did her work and withdrew, leaving him space because space was what a wounded thing needed before it could accept that it was safe. That night she heard him talking in his sleep again. "Thomas," The name came through the darkness like a bell struck underwater, muffled and resonant and unbearably sad. I'm sorry, I should have protected you. That was the only thing I had to do. In the kitchen where Alara sat with a cup of tea she was too tired to drink, she added this to the growing collection of fragments. Thomas. A brother she was almost certain. Someone Caleb had been supposed to protect. Someone he had failed. The locked chest beneath the bed. The scar on his forearm. The 3 years of self-imposed exile on a mountain where the wind never stopped and the silence was absolute. She was beginning to see the shape of it. Not the details, not yet, but the outline. The architecture of a grief so massive that a man had built his entire life around it, the way a city builds around a cathedral, everything oriented toward the central, towering, inescapable fact of it. On the fourth morning, something changed. Alara woke at dawn as she always did and went to the main room to check on Caleb. She found him awake, propped against the wall and on the small table beside his pallet, still steaming in the cold morning air, sat a pot of hot water. He had gotten up, on a leg that should not have been bearing weight. In pain that must have been significant. He had gotten up, built the fire back from embers, heated water, and set it out for her. He did not look at her, did not acknowledge what he had done. Simply sat with his face turned toward the window where the first light was turning the snow on the peaks from blue to gold. Alara picked up the pot, poured the water, made tea. Thank you, she said. Caleb said nothing, but he did not turn away. It was, she understood, the first thing he had done for another human being in 3 years. That evening, for the first time, Caleb ate the food she prepared. He did not compliment it, did not say thank you, simply picked up the bowl of venison stew and ate in silence, his eyes fixed on the fire. But he ate, and Alara counted that as a victory larger than any battle. She was sitting in her chair mending a tear in one of his shirts when she heard it. Hoofbeats, coming up the mountain trail. Moving fast for the terrain, reckless for the ice, driven by urgency or anger or both. Caleb heard it too. His body changed in an instant. The wounded man on the pallet disappeared. What replaced him was something older, something trained into muscle and bone through years of hunting men through mountains just like these. His hand reached for the space beneath his pillow, where Alara realized with a start he had placed a revolver she had not known he possessed. His eyes went to the door, then the windows, mapping the cabin's vulnerabilities with the cold expertise of a man who had spent his life thinking about angles of attack. Edgar Finn came through the door, breathing hard, his face the color of old ash. He did not sit down. He did not remove his hat. He stood in the doorway and delivered the news the way a man delivers a punch, straight and without preparation. 3 strangers in town arrived yesterday, asking about you. Edgar's voice was tight. One of them dresses like a businessman. Talks real polite. Has these gray eyes that make your skin crawl. The other 2 are hired muscle, armed to the teeth. Caleb's face did not change, but his hand tightened on the revolver until his knuckles went white. Slade, he said. One word. He did not explain it. Did not need to. Edgar nodded. They were at Martha's store, asking questions. Polite about it, but polite like a rattlesnake is polite right before it strikes. Martha said she didn't know you. He smiled at her and said he'd ask again tomorrow and hoped her memory would improve. Silence filled the cabin. The fire cracked and popped. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls with the patience of something that has forever. And somewhere 3 days' ride down the mountain, a man named Jasper Slade was smiling his careful smile and preparing to finish what his brother had started. What Alara did not know yet, what she would learn in pieces over the days ahead, was this: the brother was named Garrett Slade. Garrett had been a murderer, and Caleb had killed him with his bare hands 3 years ago in a cave in these very mountains, while the snow turned red and a boy named Thomas stopped breathing and the world broke in a way that could never be fully repaired. But she did not know that yet. What she knew was that Caleb was trying to stand, was reaching for a coat, was saying through clenched teeth, "You need to go. Both of you. Take Edgar's cart. Go down the mountain. Go now." And what she knew was her own answer, which came out before she could think better of it, before she could weigh the consequences, before she could do anything except respond from the place inside her that had survived Pemberton and Boston and 2,000 miles of winter travel and a wolf-killed man on a cabin floor. No. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Caleb stared at her. The predator's gaze returned, assessing, calculating. But beneath it, something else. Something that looked, if you knew where to look, like a crack in a dam. Alara stood her ground. 5 feet 4 inches of Boston stubbornness planted in front of 6 feet 3 inches of Rocky Mountain fury. I was not traded like a horse, she said. I chose to come here. I choose to stay. And I choose to fight. The cabin held its breath. Outside, the wind blew. The mountain stood. And somewhere on the trail below, getting closer with every hour, a man with the patience of a spider and the smile of a saint was coming to settle a debt in blood. The question was not whether he would arrive. The question was what he would find when he did. And the answer to that question would change everything. But Caleb Hawthorne did not hear the word no the way Alara meant it. He heard it the way a man hears a death sentence for someone he has just begun to realize he does not want to lose. His face went hard, harder than she had seen it even during the worst of the surgery, even when the needle was pulling catgut through torn muscle, and his teeth were grinding against each other hard enough to crack enamel. This was a different kind of hardness. This was a man staring at a future he had already lived through once and could not survive again. You don't know what you are asking. His voice was gravel dragged across stone. You don't know who he is. Then tell me. No. Tell me, Caleb. He looked at her then, truly looked the way he had looked at her that first moment when his eyes snapped open and his hand caught her wrist. Assessing. Measuring. But this time what he was measuring was not whether she was a threat. It was whether she could bear the weight of what he was about to say. The fire cracked. Edgar stood in the doorway, hat still in his hand, saying nothing. The old miner knew when to speak and when to let silence do its work. His name is Jasper Slade, Caleb said. Each word came out like he was paying for it. His brother was Garrett Slade. He stopped. Alara waited. She had learned from Florence that the most important skill in medicine was not cutting or stitching. It was listening. It was creating a space where the patient could bring out the thing that was killing them and lay it on the table where it could be examined in the light. Garrett Slade was a killer, not a gunfighter, not a bounty hunter, not a man who killed in defense or for pay. A killer, the kind that enjoys it. He murdered 7 people that we know about, probably more. Families, women, children. He didn't care. The law couldn't touch him because he operated in territories where the law was just a word people used when they wanted to feel safe. Caleb's hand went to his left forearm. His fingers traced the old scar there, the long white line running from wrist to elbow, and Alara watched the gesture with the clinical attention of a woman who had been cataloging his wounds since the moment she arrived. 3 years ago, the federal marshals hired me to bring him in, dead or alive. I took the job. A pause, something dark moved behind his eyes. I took the job because I thought I was the best, because I thought I could handle anything the mountains threw at me. Because I was arrogant enough to believe that being fast with a gun and smart with a trail was enough to keep the people around me safe. The cabin seemed to grow smaller. The walls pressed in. The fire threw shadows that danced like memories given form. I had a partner, Caleb said. And now his voice changed, dropped into a register that Alara had only heard once before in the darkness of the previous night when he spoke a name in his sleep like a prayer. My brother. Thomas. There it was, the name, the wound, the thing at the center of everything. Thomas was 6 years younger than me, 39 years old when we tracked Garrett Slade into the mountains. Still laughed like he was 19. He was... Caleb stopped, swallowed, started again. He was the kind of person who laughed at everything, found something funny in the worst situations, used to drive me crazy with it. We'd be tracking a man through a blizzard, half-frozen horses stumbling, and Thomas would crack a joke about the weather. Said the cold was God's way of telling people they should have stayed home. Alara did not move, did not breathe too loudly. She became the silence that his words needed to exist in. We tracked Garrett into a series of caves above the tree line. I told Thomas to stay outside. Watch the entrance. Let me go in alone because the caves were narrow and Garrett would be cornered, and a cornered killer is the most dangerous kind. Caleb's jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck stood out like cables. Thomas didn't listen. He never listened. Said he wasn't going to let his big brother walk into a cave alone. Said that's not what brothers do. The fire popped. A log collapsed into embers, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney like tiny, desperate stars. Garrett was waiting inside. He'd heard us coming, had positioned himself behind a rock formation with a clear line of sight to the entrance. When Thomas came through behind me, Garrett shot him. Caleb's voice went flat, dead level. The voice of a man reporting facts that had long ago burned through every emotional response he possessed and left only the bare, scorched truth. The bullet hit Thomas in the chest. He went down. I turned and killed Garrett with my hands. Didn't even use my gun. Just reached him and killed him. Took maybe 30 seconds. By the time it was done, my brother was dying on the cave floor. He stopped talking. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the heaviest thing in the room. Heavier than the log walls, heavier than the mountain above them, heavier than the 3 years of solitary penance that Caleb had built on top of it. He died looking at me. Caleb's voice broke on the word looking. Not a dramatic break, not a sob, just a crack of fissure, the sound of a structure that had been holding too much weight for too long. Not angry, not blaming, just scared. Scared and hurting and looking at his big brother like I could fix it, like I could stop what was happening, and I couldn't. I held him, and I couldn't do a single thing. He raised his head, met Ilara's eyes, and what she saw there was not the cold predator, not the wounded bear, not the man who growled at her and refused her food and turned his face to the wall. What she saw was a 48-year-old man who had been carrying his dead brother on his back for 3 years and had climbed a mountain to do it in private where no one would see him buckle under the weight. That scar on my arm, he said, and his fingers touched the white line again. Garrett, right before I killed him. Last wound of my last hunt. I came up here after, built the cabin. Haven't left since. Ilara was quiet for a long time. She understood now. All of it. The isolation, the hostility, the locked chest beneath the bed that he checked every night, the chest that contained the belongings of a dead boy who had laughed at blizzards and followed his brother into a cave because he could not bear to let him go alone. She also understood something that Caleb could not see because he was standing too close to it. She understood that his exile was not grief, it was punishment. He had sentenced himself to life imprisonment on a mountain because he believed he had failed the one person he was supposed to protect. The cabin was not a home, it was a cell, and the man inside it was both prisoner and warden. She could have said, "It wasn't your fault." She knew he would not believe it. She could have said, "Thomas wouldn't blame you." She knew he would dismiss it. Instead, she said the only thing that had any chance of reaching him. "Would Thomas want you to live like this?" Caleb stared at her. "Alone on a mountain, punishing yourself, waiting to die." She let the words sit, let them find their way past the defenses he had spent 3 years building. "Is this what your brother would want for you?" He did not answer, but something in his face moved, shifted, like tectonic plates deep underground, invisible on the surface but reshaping everything beneath. That evening, for the first time, Caleb did not retreat to his pallet after eating. He sat by the fire, not close to Ilara, not far, just present in the same room in the same warmth, breathing the same air. They did not speak. The fire burned, the wind pressed against the windows, and two people who had spent too long alone occupied the same silence, and the silence was different than it had been before. It was not the silence of isolation. It was the silence of two people who do not need to talk to know that something has changed. Edgar stayed the night again, sleeping in the armchair, his snoring providing the ordinary human soundtrack that the cabin had been missing for 3 years. Before he left in the morning, he pulled Ilara aside. "Jasper Slade isn't like his brother," Edgar said, voice low. "Garrett was a mad dog. You could see the crazy in his eyes from 50 feet. Jasper is something worse. He's patient. He plans. He'll come when Caleb is weakest, and he'll make it hurt as long as possible. That's the kind of man he is." "How much time do we have?" 2 days, maybe less if they're pushing the horses." 2 days. Ilara looked at Caleb through the doorway. He was sitting on the edge of his pallet, trying to stand on his wounded leg, testing, grimacing, calculating how much it could bear. He moved like a man inventorying his weapons before a fight, cataloging what he had and what he lacked. 2 days. And the man who was supposed to fight was still limping from a wolf attack and weakened from blood loss. Against 3 armed men led by someone who had spent 3 years planning this revenge. Edgar, Ilara said, I need you to do something for me in town. Name it. Buy me valerian root, as much as Martha has, and any other sedative herbs she carries. Chamomile, hops, passion flower, if she has it. Ilara paused. And don't tell anyone why. Edgar looked at her, then at Caleb, then back at her. The old miner had survived Caven's floods and 30 years of dynamite. He knew the look of someone who was building something, even if he couldn't see the blueprints yet. I'll have it up here by tomorrow afternoon, he said. He left. Ilara went back inside. Caleb was on his feet now, barely holding the wall for support, his face tight with pain, but his eyes clear and focused. What are you planning? He asked. A way to survive this that doesn't require you to outdraw 3 men while standing on one leg. I can handle Slade. You can barely handle the walk from your bed to the door. Ilara crossed her arms. You think like a gunfighter. Maybe it's time to think like a healer. I'm not a healer. No, but I am. She told him the plan. Not all of it, not yet. She gave him the pieces he needed, the way she had learned to deliver information one piece at a time, building toward a picture that would only come into focus when all the pieces were in place. The mountains around them knew about traps. Every hunter who worked these peaks understood that the most effective trap was not the one that used force. It was the one that used expectation. You studied what the animal expected to find. Then you gave it exactly that, with one difference. One hidden difference that changed everything. Jasper Slade expected to find a wounded gunfighter. A man alone, weak and cornered. He expected a fight. Expected to walk in with his 2 hired guns and overwhelm Caleb through superior numbers in the advantage of health over injury. What Jasper did not expect was a woman. The next 2 days were the longest of Ilara's life, and in a way she had not anticipated, the most alive she had ever felt. Caleb prepared the external defenses, trip wires strung across the approaches to the cabin made from thin rope that blended with the underbrush, small bells attached to branches at key points along the trail, positioned so that any man walking through would set them ringing without knowing he had announced himself. False trails cut into the snow leading toward dead ends and cliff faces designed to slow anyone who did not know the mountain the way Caleb did. He worked despite his leg, limped from one position to the next with a determination that was painful to watch, his face gray with effort, his jaw locked against every step. When Ilara told him to rest, he looked at her with an expression that said rest was a concept from a language he no longer spoke. But he let her help, let her carry the rope, let her hold the stakes while he hammered them, let her walk beside him as he pointed out the terrain, explaining angles of approach, lines of sight, the places where the mountain would funnel any attacker into narrow channels where numbers meant less than knowledge. She learned from him. Not just the practical skills, though those were valuable. She learned how he thought, how his mind mapped a landscape in terms of threat and advantage, cover and exposure, how his eyes read the snow for tracks the way she read a wound for signs of infection. He was a brilliant tactical mind operating inside a body that was currently failing him, and the frustration of that failure showed in every stiff movement, every suppressed grimace. And he learned from her. When she showed him the herbs, Edgar brought up the mountain when she explained their properties, when she demonstrated how valerian root properly concentrated could put a grown man into a sleep deep enough to render him helpless for hours. Something changed in the way he looked at her. Not the predator's assessment, not the wounded bear's suspicion. Respect. The genuine article earned through demonstrated competence, which was the only currency Caleb Hawthorne accepted. You want to drug them? He said. I want to neutralize the advantage of numbers. Ilara was grinding the dried root with a mortar and pestle she had brought in her suitcase, one of Florence's parting gifts. You can handle Slade one-on-one, you've told me that. The problem is the other 2. If I can take them out of the equation, you only have to deal with one man. And you'll do this, how? By being exactly what Slade expects a mail-order bride from Boston to be. Ilara looked up from her work. Weak, frightened, desperate, a woman who would betray the man she's with to save her own skin. I'll open the door. I'll let them in. I'll offer them tea because that's what a terrified, helpless woman from the East would do when confronted by armed men. And the tea will be drugged. The tea will be persuasive. Caleb stared at her. Something worked behind his eyes. Then slowly, for the first time since she had known him, one corner of his mouth moved, barely perceptible, a fraction of an inch, but unmistakably, undeniably the ghost of a smile. "You're something else, Alara Whitfield." "I'm your wife," she said. The words came out before she could think about them, before she could weigh them, before she could decide whether she meant them as strategy or truth. "At least as far as Slade is concerned, which means I have every reason to want him gone." The smile faded. Something else took its place. Something warmer and more dangerous than a smile. Something that lived in the space between his eyes and hers like heat rising from sun-baked stone. He did not say anything, but he held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and in that moment Alara felt something shift inside her chest, a door opening to a room she had not known existed. She turned back to her grinding, focused on the herbs, reminded herself that she was preparing for a fight, not a future, but her hands were trembling and it had nothing to do with the cold. That night, the night before Jasper Slade was expected to arrive, Caleb sat by the fire and Alara sat beside him, and neither of them pretended that the closeness was accidental. The cabin had changed in the week she had been there. Clean windows let in starlight. The floor was scrubbed. Dried wildflowers she had found, preserved in a tin on a shelf, relics from some past autumn, now hung in small bundles from the rafters. The air smelled of wood smoke and the herbal preparations she had been making, and something else, something unnameable that had to do with the simple fact of two people sharing a space. Caleb spoke first. His voice came low, quiet, barely louder than the fire. 3 years. In 3 years, this is the first week I haven't woken up wishing I hadn't." Alara did not respond immediately. She let the words exist. Let them breathe. "The first morning you heated water for me," she said. "That was the first morning I felt safe since my mother died." He turned his head to look at her. In the firelight, the hard lines of his face softened. Not much, enough. The granite remained, but the ice that had coated it was beginning to thin. "If tomorrow goes wrong," he said, "if Slade is smarter than we think, if something happens to me, you take Edgar's trail down the mountain, the one that cuts through the ravine east of here. Slade won't know about it. You go to Silver Creek and you keep going. Don't stop until you're somewhere he can't reach. And if something happens to you," Ilar said, "who's going to stop me from doing something very foolish and very brave instead of running Ilara?" "Caleb." He made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something in between, the sound of a wall developing a crack it cannot repair. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met. You advertised for a wife who was willing to work. You didn't say anything about obedient." This time the smile was real. Small and reluctant and gone almost before it arrived, but real. It changed his face in ways that the firelight alone could not account for. Made him look younger. Made him look like someone who had once known how to laugh. They sat in silence after that, shoulder nearly touching shoulder, the fire burning low, the mountain holding its breath outside the windows. And somewhere on the trail below, getting closer with every hour, Jasper Slade rode through the darkness and with patience in his eyes and murder in his plans. He arrived at dawn. The bells gave him away. Faint chiming from the eastern approach, the sound carrying on cold air that was still and crystalline. Caleb's eyes opened instantly, going from sleep to full alertness with the speed of a man who had spent 2 decades hunting dangerous prey. He rolled off the pallet and reached for the revolver beneath his pillow in a single fluid moan that belied his injured leg. Alara was already awake. She had barely slept. She stood at the kitchen counter where her preparations were laid out. 3 cups, a kettle of water already hot on the stove, a small pouch of dried herbs carefully measured enough sedative to drop a horse, and in the pocket of her apron, a small glass vial of concentrated herbal oil sharp enough to make eyes burn and lungs seize. Her insurance policy, her last resort. 3 horses, Caleb said from the window, his body pressed against the wall, one eye on the trail through a crack in the shutter. "Coming slow, careful. They're watching for traps." "Did they find the tripwires?" "Braddock did. The big one on the left. Went down, but he's back up. They're being more cautious now." His voice was detached, clinical. The bounty hunter's voice. "Slade's in the middle, riding easy, taking his time. The other one, Colt, is bringing up the rear with a rifle across his saddle. Alara took a breath, let it out, took another. Remember the plan, she said. I remember. Caleb looked at her. One long look that contained everything he could not say and everything he might never get the chance to say. Don't take unnecessary risks. If it goes wrong, you run. Promise me. I promise I'll do what needs to be done. It was not the promise he wanted, but it was the only one she could give. They took their positions. Caleb on the bedshirt removed to show the bandaged wound revolver hidden beneath the pillow, his body arranged to look weak and helpless. It was remarkable acting from a man who even wounded radiated danger the way a forge radiates heat. He forced his breathing to shallow out, let his skin go pale, closed his eyes to slits. Alara mussed her hair, smudged dirt on her dress, pinched her cheeks until her eyes watered. She looked at herself in the small mirror by the door and saw what she needed to see, a frightened woman on the edge of hysteria, a victim looking for rescue. The hoofbeats stopped outside. 3 horses, the creak of saddle leather as men dismounted, footsteps on the frozen ground deliberate and unhurried. A knock at the door, not aggressive, polite. The knock of a man who believed he held every card in the deck and could afford to be civilized about it. Alara opened the door. 3 men stood on the porch. The one in front was not what she expected. Jasper Slade was lean, clean-shaven, dressed in a dark wool coat that would have been appropriate on a Boston street. His hair was sandy and neatly parted. His boots were polished. He looked like a banker or a lawyer, the kind of man you might trust with your money or your contracts. Then you saw his eyes, gray, the color of a sky before a killing frost, and empty in a way that had nothing to do with lack of intelligence. They were full of intelligence, overflowing with it, but the intelligence was cold, calculated, the intelligence of a man who had long ago decided that other people existed primarily as instruments of his will. Behind him stood Colt and Braddock. Colt was wiry, sharp-faced with the restless energy of a man who liked hurting people and was good at it. Braddock was simply enormous, a wall of muscle and bone topped by a small head and smaller eyes. Both wore gun belts with the casual ease of men who use them the way other men use tools. Alara let the door swing wide. Let her hands shake. Let her voice break on the first word. Please. She made it a gasp, a plea, the sound of a woman who had been holding herself together by threads and had just felt the last one snap. Please help me. The man inside, he brought me here. He won't let me leave. Please, you have to help me. Jasper's eyes moved from her face to the interior of the cabin behind her. His expression did not change. It remained pleasant, courteous, the expression of a man listening to a story he found mildly interesting. You must be the mail-order bride, he said. His voice was soft, cultured, the kind of voice that would sound equally appropriate delivering a sermon or reading a death warrant. What a shame, sent all this way only to end up with a dying animal. Alara stepped back, letting them see into the room where Caleb lay motionless on the bed, the bandaged wound visible, his breathing shallow, his eyes closed. The picture of a man at the end of his resources. Jasper walked inside. His movements were unhurried, his eyes taking in every detail of the cabin with the thoroughness of a man accustomed to entering spaces where someone might be waiting to kill him. He noted the exits, the windows, the placement of furniture. Then he stood over Caleb's prone form and smiled. It was the worst smile Alara had ever seen. Not cruel in the obvious way, not a sneer or a snarl. A genuine smile. The smile of a man looking at something he had been waiting 3 years to see. The way a collector smiles when he finally acquires the piece that completes his collection. Hello, Hawthorne. Jasper's voice was barely above a whisper. You're a hard man to find, but I've always been a patient man. Caleb's eyelids flickered. He managed a groan that sounded authentically weak, a masterful performance from a man whose every muscle was coiled to spring. Slade. The word came out rasped, defeated. Garrett says hello. Jasper leaned closer. Well, he would if you hadn't beaten him to death with your bare hands in that cave. But I imagine his ghost has been keeping you company up here. 3 years alone on a mountain with nothing but guilt and ghosts. That must have been a special kind of hell. Alara moved to the kitchen counter. Her hands worked with practiced calm, despite the terror hammering in her chest. I was going to make tea, she said, her voice small and uncertain. Before you arrived, it's the only civilized thing I can offer. The hospitality of a woman who knows this is the end. She poured hot water over the herbs in 3 cups. The sedative was in 2 of them, dissolved and invisible, the bitter taste masked by honey and chamomile. The 3rd cup, Jasper's cup, contained nothing but ordinary tea. Because she had guessed from Edgar's description that Jasper Slade was not the kind of man who accepted anything from a stranger's hand without suspicion. She carried the cups to the table on a tray, set them down where all 3 men could reach them. Braddock took his without hesitation. The big man drank the way he did everything, with blunt, uncomplicated directness. Colt hesitated for a moment and then drank. He was cold-tired from the ride, and the warm liquid was welcome after a night in the freezing mountain air. Jasper lifted his cup, looked at it, set it down without drinking. "Tell me," he said to Alara, his gray eyes fixed on her face with an attention that felt like being pressed against a wall. "How long has he been like this?" 5 days. Alara kept her voice trembling. "He was attacked by a wolf. I've been trying to treat the wound, but I don't have the right supplies. The infection is spreading. His fever won't break. I've done everything I know how to do." "And you're a nurse, I hear." Something cold slithered down Alara's spine. He knew about her, had done his research, had gathered information the way a hunter gathers intelligence about the terrain before he enters it. "I have some training," she said, made her voice smaller, more helpless. "A midwife in Boston taught me basic medicine, but this is beyond what I know. I'm just a girl from the city. I don't know anything about surviving out here." Jasper studied her. Those gray eyes moved over her face the way a jeweler examines a stone, looking for flaws, for inclusions, for anything that would diminish the value of what he was seeing. Then Braddock made a sound, a low grunt, confused, like a man trying to remember something he had forgotten. His hand went to his forehead. He blinked, blinked again. His massive body swayed like a tree that has been cut at the base and hasn't yet decided which direction to fall. Colt noticed. "Brad, you all right?" Braddock didn't answer. His eyes went glassy. His knees buckled. Jasper's head snapped toward the falling man, then back to Alara, then to the cups on the table. And in that instant, the pleasant mass dropped away, and what was underneath was exactly what Edgar had described. Not mad dog crazy like his brother. Something worse. Something precise and calculated and utterly without mercy. He drew his revolver and pointed it at Alara's chest. What was in the tea? Alara's act dissolved. There was no point maintaining it now. She looked into those gray eyes and saw death looking back at her patient, and organized and completely certain of itself. "Nothing," she said. She made her voice small again. Confused. Innocent. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a mail-order bride from Boston. I don't know anything about poisons or herbs or any of that. Look at me." She held up her hands, made them shake. "Does this look like someone who knows how to drug a man?" It was the performance of her life. She played every note that men like Jasper Slade expected to hear from a woman in this situation. Weak, ignorant, terrified, incapable of strategy or deception. She became the wallpaper, the furniture, the empty vessel that powerful men assumed all women were. For 3 heartbeats, it worked. Jasper's gun wavered. His eyes narrowed, reassessing. Then Braddock hit the floor. 240 pounds of hired muscle crashing down like a felled oak, the impact shaking the cabin walls. His cup rolled across the planks empty. Colt staggered. The wiry man reached for the table to steady himself. It missed, grabbed the back of a chair instead. His rifle, which he had been holding loosely at his side, clattered to the floor. Jasper did not look at them. He kept his eyes on Alara, and slowly, terribly, he smiled again. Clever girl. He moved fast, faster than a man in polished boots and a banker's coat should have been able to move. His hand shot out and caught Alara's wrist, spinning her around, pulling her back against his chest. The gun barrel pressed against her temple. Cold metal on warm skin. "Get up, Hawthorne." Jasper's voice was calm, conversational, as though he were inviting a friend to dinner. "I know you're awake. I knew from the moment I walked in. A man like you doesn't sleep that deeply, not even dying. Get up and drop whatever weapon you have hidden under that pillow, or I will put a bullet through this woman's brain." Caleb opened his eyes. The act fell away from him, too. What was underneath was not the wounded man or the hermit or the reluctant host. What was underneath was the man who had tracked Garrett Slade through these mountains and killed him with his bare hands. The bounty hunter, the predator, the man who had been the most dangerous thing in the Rocky Mountains before he decided to stop being anything at all. He sat up, the revolver in his right hand pointed at Jasper. His eyes locked on the gun at Alara's temple, and Alara saw something in them that she had never seen before. Not anger, not tactical calculation. Fear. Raw, undiluted soul, deep terror. Not for himself, for her. Let her go, Slade. His voice was steady, his hand was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. They were the eyes of a man looking at a nightmare he had already lived through, once the nightmare of someone he cared about with a weapon pressed against them, and the certainty that if he failed again, if his hands were not fast enough, or his aim not true enough, the person he had begun to love would die the same way his brother had died, looking at him, trusting him, while he proved unworthy of that trust. Drop the gun first. Jasper pressed the barrel harder against Alara's temple. She felt the metal indent her skin. Drop it, or I finish what I came here to do, and I start with her. This is between you and me. She has nothing to do with this. She has everything to do with it. Jasper's smile widened. You took my brother. I take someone from you. That's how justice works, Hawthorne. Eye for an eye, blood for blood. Or did you think you could kill a Slade and walk away clean? Colt collapsed, the second man down, slumping against the wall and sliding to the floor with his eyes rolling back. The sedative working through his system like a river through a dam, unstoppable once it started. Jasper and Caleb. That was all that was left. One man with a gun against a woman's head. One man with a gun that could not fire without risking the life of the only person on earth he was not willing to lose. Alara's hand moved, not fast, not dramatically. She simply slid her fingers into the pocket of her apron where the small glass vial had been waiting since before dawn. Her insurance policy, her last resort. Concentrated herbal oil, the smell sharp enough to sear the lining of a man's nose, and the vapors potent enough to make eyes water and lungs contract. She closed her fingers around the vial, looked at Caleb, found his eyes and held them. And in that look, she sent him everything she could not say out loud. Trust me, I am not Thomas. I am not helpless. I am not going to die on this floor while you watch. Then she spoke, her voice steady as a surgeon's hand. You showed me what really needs healing, Caleb. It was never the wound on your leg. She brought the vial up and shattered it against Jasper's face. The concentrated oil hit his eyes, his nose, his open mouth. The smell alone was enough to make a man retch. In his eyes, it was liquid fire. Jasper screamed, the first genuine uncontrolled sound Alara had heard him make. The gun at her temple jerked away as both his hands went to his face. Alara drove her elbow backward into his stomach with every ounce of strength her small frame possessed. She was free. Caleb crossed the distance in 2 strides. Bad leg and all, wounded and bleeding from where the old scar on his forearm had torn open in the exertion. He reached Jasper Slade and hit him with a fist that carried 3 years of grief and rage and sleepless nights. The sound it made was like a branch breaking in a storm. Jasper's head snapped back. He went down. His gun skittered across the floor. Caleb was on him, pinning him down, pressing the revolver under Jasper's jaw with a hand that no longer trembled. His face was a mask of controlled fury, the expression of a man who has been given the thing he wanted most and the thing he feared most at the same time. He killed Thomas. Caleb's voice came from somewhere deep and broken, somewhere beneath the bounty hunter and the hermit and the man who heated water for a woman he barely knew. Your brother killed my brother, and now you come here, to my home, and you put a gun to her head. Jasper's eyes were streaming, his face swelling where Caleb's fist had landed, but his voice was steady. Do it then. Kill me. That's what you are, Hawthorne. A killer. It's all you've ever been. Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. Alara could see it from across the room, could see the tendons in his hand standing out the knuckle, whitening the infinitesimal movement that separated the living from the dead. She crossed the room, placed her hand on his arm, the arm holding the gun. She did not pull, did not push, did not try to force him in any direction. She simply placed her hand there, her palm against his forearm, her fingers resting on the old scar that his brother's killer had given him. And she spoke. Thomas. One word. the most powerful word she knew. Thomas wouldn't want this. Her voice was quiet, not pleading, not demanding, just true. He wouldn't want you to kill a man on his knees because of him. He would want you to live, Caleb. Not just survive, live. There's a difference, and killing this man will close the door on the living side forever. The cabin held its breath. The fire crackled. Outside, the horses stamped and blew, indifferent to the choices being made inside the small wooden structure on the mountainside. Caleb looked at the gun in his hand, looked at Jasper's face, looked at Alara, and slowly, like the tide going out, the darkness receded from his eyes. He lowered the gun, stood up, stepped back. Get him out of here. His voice was hoarse, scraped raw, the voice of a man who has just walked to the edge of an abyss and chosen not to jump. Edgar's coming up the trail. Give Slade and his men to him. Let the law handle it. Federal marshals can have them. Alara bound Jasper's hands with rope. Then Colts, once the sedative, let her move him. Braddock would not wake for hours. She worked efficiently without hurry, the way she did everything. Edgar arrived within the hour, having started up the mountain at first light, when he heard the distant echo of a gunshot bounce off the canyon walls. He brought 2 men from town with him, miners who owed him favors, and carried rifles they knew how to use. They loaded the 3 prisoners onto their horses and began the long trip down to Silver Creek, where the nearest telegraph office could summon federal law. Jasper looked back as they led him away. His face was swollen, his eyes red and weeping from the herbal oil, but his voice was clear. You think this is over, Hawthorne? He smiled through split lips. There's someone in Boston who wants your bride back. I made sure of that. Wrote him a letter before I came up here. A man named Pemberton. Rich. Connected. Owns lawyers the way other men own horses. His smile widened. Even if you beat me, you can't beat him. He's already coming for her. The words hit Alara like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face, felt the mountain tilt beneath her feet. Jasper had planned for this, had known that even if his direct assault failed, he could still achieve his goal. Make Caleb suffer, take away the person he cared about, not through a bullet, but through the law, through the long arm of a rich man's reach, through papers and warrants, and the machinery of a society that treated women as property to be owned and transferred. Edgar led the prisoners away. The sound of hooves faded down the mountain. Silence returned, but it was a different silence now. Not empty, full of everything that had happened and everything that was coming. Caleb and Alara stood in the cabin. The floor was marked with scuff marks and blood spots and the impression where Braddock's massive body had hit the planks. The air still smelled of gunpowder and crushed herbs. 2 empty cups sat on the table. Caleb turned to Alara. His face was battered from exertion, the old scar on his arm bleeding through a makeshift bandage, his wounded leg trembling beneath him. But his eyes were clear, clearer than she had ever seen them, as if the act of choosing mercy over vengeance had cleaned a lens that had been dirty for 3 years. You saved me. His voice was rough. Again. We saved each other. Alara's hands were shaking now that the crisis had passed, the tremors she had suppressed through the entire confrontation finally demanding their due. I broke the vial. You did the rest. That's not what I mean. He took a step toward her, then another, closed the distance between them with the same deliberate, careful movement he brought to everything that mattered. You saved me from becoming the thing Slade wanted me to be, from proving that I'm nothing but a killer. He stood before her, close enough to touch. Close enough that she could feel the heat of him through the cold air, could smell the pine resin and wood smoke and sweat that was his particular scent, as much a part of the mountain as the trees themselves. Alara, he said her name the way other men said prayers. You came to my cabin uninvited. Saved my life when I didn't ask for it. Cleaned my house when I didn't want it. Changed my world when I didn't give permission. His hand came up, hovered near her face, trembling and not from exhaustion. What am I supposed to do with you? She reached up and took his hand, brought it to her cheek, held it there. Keep me, she said. And in the ruined cabin, with the smell of battle still hanging in the air and the echoes of gunfire still ringing off the mountains, Caleb Hawthorne leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, And they stood like that for a long time, breathing together, two people who had come to this mountain broken and were beginning slowly, painfully, beautifully to heal. But Jasper's words hung in the air like smoke that would not clear. Pemberton. The name that had chased Alara across a continent was still chasing her, and it was getting closer. The war was not over. It had simply changed shape, and the next battle would not be fought with guns and traps and herbal sedatives. It would be fought with paper and law and the terrible grinding machinery of men who believed that money could buy anything, including a woman's freedom. Caleb did not know that yet, but Alara did. And lying awake that night, listening to his breathing, finally even out into genuine peaceful sleep, for the first time since she had known him, she stared at the ceiling and began to plan. Because Alara Whitfield, who had crossed 2,000 miles of winter to escape in one cage, was not going to let anyone build her another one. Not Pemberton, not the law, not the world that said a woman was property and a man's signature on a piece of paper was worth more than her right to choose her own life. She had found something on this mountain, something she had not been looking for and could not bear to lose. A home, a purpose, a man who looked at her like she was the first warm day after an endless winter, and she would fight for it with everything she had. Even if everything she had was a suitcase full of medical supplies, a head full of herbal knowledge, and the kind of iron will that had once made a midwife in Boston shake her head and say, "God help the man who tries to tell that girl what to do." God help him indeed. The letter arrived 11 days after Jasper Slade was taken down the mountain in ropes. Edgar Finn carried it up the trail on a Tuesday morning, his mule picking its way through the last stubborn patches of snow that clung to the north-facing slopes like old men refusing to leave their chairs. Spring was coming to the Rockies. You could feel it in the way the air had softened, in the way the ice on the creek had thinned to glass that shattered when you touched it, in the way the birds had returned to the pine trees and filled the mornings with a sound the mountain had not heard in months. 11 days of quiet, 11 days of healing. Not just the wound on Caleb's leg, which was closing cleanly. Now the stitches holding the flesh, knitting itself back together with the stubborn efficiency of a body that had survived worse. And not just the bruises on Alara's wrist, where Jasper's grip had left purple fingerprints that faded through yellow and green before finally disappearing altogether. The deeper healing, the kind that does not leave scars you can see. Caleb had begun to talk, not constantly, not the way some men talked when they discovered they had an audience after years of silence. He talked the way the mountain thawed gradually in patches, with occasional setbacks, when the cold crept back in and froze over ground that had just been cleared. He told Alara about growing up in Virginia, about the farm his parents had worked until his father was killed by a falling tree during a clearing operation, and his mother sent both boys to live with an uncle on the frontier because she could not feed them alone. He told her about learning to track, to hunt, to read the land the way literate men read books. About the first bounty he ever collected, a horse thief named Delacroix, who had been stealing from homesteaders along the Platte River. Caleb had been 23. Thomas had been 17, too young to carry a gun legally, but old enough to ride alongside his brother and watch and learn. He told her about Thomas, not all at once, in pieces, the way a man handles something precious that has been broken. Thomas, who collected rocks from every place they traveled and kept them in a leather pouch that grew heavier with every mile. Thomas, who could whistle any song after hearing it once. Thomas, who had once talked a Comanche war party out of killing them by offering the chief his favorite rock, a piece of quartz shot through with the gold veins that he had found in a creek bed in Montana, and explaining in terrible broken Comanche that the rock was magic and would bring good fortune. The chief had laughed so hard, tearily fell off his horse. They were allowed to pass. He could talk to anyone, Caleb said one evening, sitting on the porch steps while Alara rewrapped his leg. Anyone. Rich men, poor men, Indians, outlaws. Didn't matter. He'd find the human in them and talk to that. I never learned that skill. I just learned how to track things and how to fight them when I found them. Maybe that's why you needed each other, Alara said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, maybe that's why I needed you. It was the closest he had come to saying what they both knew was growing between them. Growing the way the wildflowers were growing on the southern slope, pushing through the last of the snow, reaching for light they had been denied all winter. Neither of them named it. Neither of them rushed it. They moved around each other in the small cabin with the careful awareness of two people who understood that what they were building was fragile and important and could not be forced without breaking. But it was there, in the way Caleb's hand found the small of her back when they passed in the narrow kitchen, in the way Alara's fingers lingered on his skin when she changed his bandages, in the way they sat closer on the porch each evening, their shoulders touching, watching the sun go down behind the peaks in colors that seemed too vivid to be real. In the way Caleb had begun to sleep through the night without calling Thomas's name, as though the telling of the story had loosened its grip on his dreams. 11 days of something that felt tentatively like the beginning of a life. Then Edgar came up the trail with the letter. He handed it to Alara in the doorway, his lined face arranged in the careful blankness of a man delivering news he wished he did not have to deliver. The envelope was heavy cream-colored, made of the kind of paper that costs money. The handwriting on the front was precise and practiced, each letter formed with the mechanical perfection of a man who had been educated in the best schools and had never forgotten the importance of appearances. Miss Alara Whitfield, Silver Creek, Colorado territory. Not Mrs. Hawthorne, not even Miss Whitfield, care of Mr. Hawthorne. Just her maiden name written as though the past 11 days had not happened, as though she still belonged to the life she had fled. She opened it with steady hands, read it with steady eyes, then sat down on the porch step because her legs would no longer hold her. The letter was from a lawyer, a firm in Boston called Carmichael and Sons, representing the interests of Mr. Silas Pemberton. It stated in language as precise and cold as a surgical instrument that Mr. Pemberton held a legally binding marriage contract signed by Alara's father, Nathaniel Whitfield, granting Pemberton the right to marry his daughter in exchange for the forgiveness of substantial gambling debts. Furthermore, Nathaniel Whitfield had signed a document of legal guardianship, declaring Alara mentally unfit to make her own decisions, citing her sudden and irrational flight from a beneficial marriage arrangement as evidence of her instability. The letter informed Alara that two representatives of Mr. Pemberton would be arriving in Silver Creek within the week to escort Miss Whitfield back to Boston for her own protection and welfare. It further stated that any person who interfered with this lawful process would be subject to criminal prosecution for harboring a fugitive and obstruction of legal guardianship. Alara read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully, precisely along the original creases, and placed it on the step beside her. "He found me," she said. Her voice was flat, not panicked, not tearful, flat in the way that Caleb's voice went flat when he talked about the cave where Thomas died. The voice of a person looking at something they have always feared and finding it exactly as terrible as they imagined. Caleb took the letter, read it standing up, his back against the porch rail, his face changing as his eyes moved down the page. Not a dramatic change, not visible to anyone who had not spent 11 days learning the geography of that face. But Alara saw it, saw the granite harden, saw the ice reform, saw the man who had chosen mercy over vengeance 11 days ago reconsider that choice with the cold tactical precision of the bounty hunter he had been. "He can't have you." Caleb's voice was quiet, very quiet, the quiet of deep water moving fast. "No one is taking you off this mountain. He has the law, Caleb. He has papers. He has a guardianship declaration that says I'm not competent to make my own decisions. In Boston, that document is legally binding. A judge signed it. We're not in Boston. The law reaches everywhere." Alara looked at her hands, the hands that had sutured wounds and mixed medicines and shattered a vial of herbal oil in a murderer's face. "Pemberton has money. Money buys lawyers. Lawyers buy judges. Judges issue warrants. Warrants travel. It doesn't matter that we're on a mountain in Colorado. If he wants me badly enough, he will use every tool available to drag me back." Caleb was quiet for a long time. The mountain wind moved through the pines. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals, patient and precise. "Then we take his tools away." Alara looked up. "If you were married," Caleb said, and his voice was different now. Not the bounty hunter's voice, not the hermit's voice. Something new, something she had never heard before. A voice that was afraid but moving forward anyway, the way a man moves through a door he cannot see beyond. "If you were already married when his people arrived, the contract with your father becomes void. A married woman can't be given in marriage to someone else. The guardianship falls apart because A husband has legal authority over his wife's affairs, not a stranger from Boston with a gambling debt. The words hung in the mountain air between them. You're talking about a legal strategy, Alara said. I'm talking about marrying you. Because of the letter. No, Caleb set the letter down, took a step toward her, then another. He moved the way he had moved in the cabin when the fight was over and the smoke was clearing, deliberate, certain, a man who has made a decision and will not unmake it. Not because of the letter, not because of Pemberton. Because for 3 years I've been dead, Alara. Walking and breathing and eating, but dead in every way that matters. And then you came up this mountain with your suitcase and your stubbornness and your gentle hands, and you reached into the grave I dug for myself and pulled me out. Not because I asked, not because I deserved it, because that's who you are. He stood before her, close enough to touch. The late morning sun caught the silver at his temples and the pale blue-gray of his eyes and the white line of the scar on his forearm that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. I'm asking you to marry me, not as strategy, not as protection, as a man who cannot imagine this cabin without you in it, as a man who wakes up now and the first thing he wants to see is your face, as a man who has killed and hunted and lost and grieved and climbed a mountain to die alone, and who discovered, because a woman from Boston wouldn't leave when she was told to, that he wanted to live after all. Alara's vision blurred. Tears, the first she had shed since her mother's funeral, ran down her cheeks without sound, without dramatics, just the quiet overflow of something that had been full for days and finally had permission to spill. That, she said, her voice thick, is significantly better than a legal strategy. Caleb made a sound, not quite a laugh, but close, closer than anything she had heard from him before. Is that a yes? That is a yes, Caleb Hawthorne. That is absolutely a yes. He reached for her then, pulled her to her feet and into his arms with a gentleness that should have been impossible from a man his size, from hands that had killed a man barehanded and beaten another to the floor. He held her against his chest, and she felt his heartbeat strong and steady, the heartbeat of a man who had been given a reason to keep it going. And on the porch of a cabin on a mountain in Colorado, with a hawk circling overhead and the snow melting on the peaks and a letter from a monster sitting forgotten on the step, two broken people held each other and felt for the first time in longer than either could remember whole. Edgar, who had been standing by his mule, pretending to adjust the harness, while all of this happened, cleared his throat. I'll ride down and tell Pastor Cole to get his good book ready, he said. Tomorrow morning work for you two. Tomorrow morning, Caleb said. Tomorrow morning. Alara agreed. Edgar climbed onto his mule, looked at them standing together on the porch, her head against his chest, his arms around her, and shook his head with the expression of a man watching something he had stopped believing was possible. Well, I'll be damned, he said to the mule. The bear found his heart. The mule did not comment. They were married this next morning in the small white church at the center of Silver Creek. Pastor William Cole presided, a tall, thin man with a voice built for delivering both comfort and condemnation in equal measure. He had been skeptical when Edgar arrived with the news. Caleb Hawthorne, the mountain hermit, the former bounty hunter, whose name made grown men cross the street, wanted to get married. In his church. Tomorrow. But Edgar had a way of making things happen, and Pastor Cole had a wife who thought the whole situation was desperately romantic, and Martha Henderson had already started sewing a dress before anyone officially asked her to. The dress was simple, white cotton, high-necked, with small blue flowers embroidered along the collar that Martha had stayed up half the night, stitching, because as she told Alara while fitting it that morning, every bride deserves flowers even if they're sewn on. Alara stood in the back room of the church and looked at herself in a mirror that was too small to show her whole reflection. She saw pieces, the dress, her hair which Martha had pinned up with wildflowers from the first blooms of spring, her mother's surgical scissors, which she had tucked into the sash at her waist, because Margaret Whitfield could not be at her daughter's wedding, but something of hers could. She was not nervous. She had been nervous facing Jasper Slade with a vial of herbal oil and a prayer. She had been nervous suturing a stranger's leg by lamplight on her first night in Colorado. This was not nerves. This was certainty. The bone-deep blood, warm certainty of a woman who knows exactly where she is supposed to be. She walked into the church. Caleb stood at the altar. He wore a white shirt that Edgar had pressed for him and dark trousers and boots he had cleaned until they almost looked civilized. His hair was combed, his beard was trimmed. He looked like what he was, a mountain man making his best effort to resemble someone you might bring home to meet your mother, and falling short in every way except the one that mattered, which was the expression on his face when he saw Alara walking toward him. Alara would remember that expression for the rest of her life, would carry it with her through every difficulty and every joy that followed. The face of a man seeing something he had stopped believing existed. Not just beauty, though she was beautiful. Not just hope, though she was, that too. Something larger than either. The face of a man who has been in the dark for 3 years and has just seen the sun. Edgar stood beside Caleb as his witness. Martha stood beside Alara. The pews held perhaps 30 people, Silver Creek residents, who had come partly out of curiosity and partly out of the genuine warmth that small communities develop for events that remind them they are alive. The blacksmith was there. The postmaster. The woman who ran the boarding house. 3 miners who had never spoken to Caleb in their lives, but who had heard the story of the wolf and the surgery and the mail-order bride, who faced down 3 armed men with nothing but a cup of drugged tea and a vial of herbs, and who had decided that any wedding involving those 2 people was worth attending. Pastor Cole read the vows. Caleb repeated them in a voice that did not waver, his eyes on Alara's face, as though the words were not ritual, but literal truth spoken for the first time in human history. I take thee, to have and to hold, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Alara repeated them back, and meant every syllable with a ferocity that would have startled anyone who did not know what she had survived to stand in this church in this dress beside this man. You may kiss the bride, Pastor Cole said. Caleb leaned down. Alara rose up on her toes. The kiss was brief and gentle, and entirely inadequate to express what either of them was feeling, but it was witnessed and it was real and it was legal, and when they turned to face the small congregation as husband and wife, the applause that filled the little church was louder than its size should have allowed. They walked out into spring sunshine. Martha had organized a reception in the boarding house dining room, and people were already heading that direction when the sound of hooves on the main street brought everything to a stop. 2 riders, coming from the East Road, moving at a business-like trot, not hurrying, not dawdling. Their horses were well-fed and well-groomed, the horses of men who had access to relay stations and money for fresh mounts. They wore city clothes, dark coats, bowler hats, polished shoes that had no business on a dirt road in the Colorado mountains. One carried a leather satchel that Alara recognized with a chill that went through her like a blade. A lawyer's case. They pulled up in front of the church. The taller one dismounted first. He was perhaps 40, clean-shaven, with the smooth face and manicured hands of a man who made his living in offices and courtrooms. He looked at the gathered crowd at the white church, at the woman in the wedding dress, and the large man standing beside her, and his expression was the expression of a man who has just realized that his schedule has encountered a complication. I'm looking for Miss Alara Whitfield, he said. His voice carried the flat nasal tones of a Boston accent, and Alara felt her past reach across 2,000 miles and tap her on the shoulder. There is no Alara Whitfield here. Caleb's voice, low, calm, each word placed with the precision of a man setting stones in a wall. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Alara and the riders, with a movement so natural it looked like breathing. There is an Alara Hawthorne, my wife, married this morning in this church by Pastor William Cole with 30 witnesses present. The lawyer's eyes moved to the wedding dress, to the flowers in Alara's hair, to the crowd of townsfolk standing on the church steps with the unmistakable air of people who have just attended a ceremony and are not pleased to have their celebration interrupted. I have documents, the lawyer began, reaching for a satchel, and I have a marriage certificate. Pastor Cole stepped forward. The tall, thin pastor had a voice that could fill a church without effort, and he used it now to fill a street. Signed by me, witnessed by 2 citizens of this town, and legally binding in the territory of Colorado and every state in the Union. Whatever documents you carry, sir, they pertain to a Miss Whitfield. There is no Miss Whitfield, there is a Mrs. Hawthorne. And the laws of this country do not permit a married woman to be given in marriage to another man, regardless of what contracts her father may have signed. The lawyer opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He was not accustomed to having his legal pronouncements challenged by country pastors in small mountain towns. He was accustomed to courtrooms where his firm's reputation preceded him and judges who owed favors to the men he represented. But this was not a courtroom. This was a dirt street in front of a white church, and the jury was 30 Colorado residents who had just watched a wedding and were in no mood to see it invalidated by a man in a bowler hat. The guardianship document, the lawyer tried, signed by her father, declaring her mentally unfit. Mentally unfit. Martha Henderson's voice cut through the air like a blade through butter. She stepped forward, arms crossed, 5 feet 2 inches of indignation, wrapped in a flour-dusted apron. This woman sutured a man's leg by lamplight on her first night in Colorado. She faced down 3 armed men with nothing but her wits and her medical training. She has been providing medical care to people in this town for a week and a half, and every single one of them will testify that she is the most competent, capable, intelligent woman they have ever met. If that's mentally unfit, then I'd like some of whatever she's having. A murmur of agreement from the crowd. The blacksmith nodded. The miners nodded. Even the postmaster, a man who agreed with nobody on principle, nodded. Edgar Finn stepped forward, old, limping, leaning on the porch rail with the unhurried confidence of a man who had outlasted every disaster these mountains had thrown at him. "Son," he said to the lawyer with the gentle condescension of a man addressing someone who has made a serious error in judgment, "I've been mining these mountains for 30 years. I know a losing vein when I see one. You're standing in one right now. My advice is to take your papers back to Boston and tell Mr. Pemberton that the woman he wanted is married, happy, and surrounded by people who will make his life very difficult if he tries this again." The second rider, who had not dismounted, leaned down and spoke quietly to the lawyer. A brief exchange. The lawyer's face tightened. He looked at Caleb, who had not moved, who stood like the mountain itself, immovable and patient, his arms at his sides and his eyes communicating with perfect clarity that he was willing to resolve this peacefully, but was also willing to resolve it in other ways if peaceful proved insufficient. The lawyer put his documents back in his satchel. "Mr. Pemberton will not be pleased," he said. "Mr. Pemberton's pleasure is not my concern." Caleb's voice was steady. "My wife's safety is. You can tell him that Alara chose her life. She chose it freely, legally, and permanently. If he has objections, he can present them to a court. But he should know that the court will find a legal marriage, 30 witnesses, a pastor's testimony, and an entire town willing to speak to Mrs. Hawthorne's competence in character. Against that, a coerced contract and a fraudulent guardianship declaration won't stand." The lawyer mounted his horse. The 2 men turned and rode back the way they had come. The crowd watched them until they were small, dark shapes on the eastern road, then smaller, then gone. A cheer went up, scattered at first, then full-throated. The blacksmith clapped Caleb on the shoulder hard enough to make a smaller man stagger. Martha was already crying. Edgar was pretending he was not. But it was the second rider's parting words that stayed with Alara. Spoken quietly, meant only for Caleb's ears, but Alara had been standing close enough to hear. "Pemberton doesn't stop at lawyers. He's already sent for other men, the kind that don't carry briefcases. A shadow, a thread left hanging, a reminder that the world does not always respect the happy endings we carve out for ourselves." But that was a problem for another day. Today was a wedding day. The weeks that followed were the closest thing to peace that Caleb Hawthorne had experienced since the day his brother died. He would not have used that word. Peace. It was too soft, too passive for a man who had spent his life in motion, tracking and hunting and fighting. But Alara would have used it, and gradually, reluctantly, the way a man learns a new language by immersion rather than study, Caleb began to understand what the word meant. It meant waking up to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone humming in the kitchen. It meant sitting on the porch at dawn and watching the valley fill with light while the woman he had married sat beside him with her hands wrapped around a mug, her shoulder warm against his. It meant going to bed at night and not dreading the dreams because the dreams had changed. They were no longer the cave and the blood in Thomas's eyes. They were something else now. Something he could not quite describe, but that felt when he woke from them like being handed back a piece of himself he had thought was lost forever. Alara opened her small clinic in Silvers Creek. 2 days a week she rode down the mountain on the mare Caleb had bought from a rancher in the valley, set up in the back room of Martha Henderson's store, and treated anyone who came through the door. Cuts, burns, broken bones, fevers. The everyday damage of frontier life delivered to her by miners and ranchers and their wives and children, people who had previously had to ride 2 days to the nearest doctor and who now had a trained medical practitioner 40 minutes away. Caleb came with her. Not every time at first. He was still mending, still limping, still waking some mornings with his legs stiff and aching in ways that reminded him of the wolf and the floor, and the woman who had knelt beside him with scissors and thread and told him to lie still. But more and more often, he found himself on the trail beside her, riding the mountain horse he had raised from a colt, saying little but watching everything. He began to help. It happened gradually, the way all the important changes in his life had happened since Alara arrived, not with dramatic announcements, but with small, accumulating actions that added up to transformation. He carried supplies, lifted patients who were too heavy for Alara to move, held frightened children while she examined them, built shelves for the clinic, fixed the door that stuck, constructed a proper examination table from pine planks he had cut and sanded until they were smooth enough to lay bare skin against without splinters. And then one Tuesday afternoon, something happened that changed everything. A mining family came in, father, mother, and a boy of about 8 years old. The boy's name was Samuel. He had fallen from a rock face while playing near the mine entrance, and his left arm was broken. The bone had not pierced the skin, but the forearm was visibly deformed, angled where it should have been straight, and the boy was screaming. Not crying, screaming. The high, thin, terrified shriek of a child in pain who does not understand what has happened to his body and cannot make it stop. Alara tried to examine him. Samuel screamed louder, pulled away, kicked. His mother held him, but he thrashed so violently that she could not keep him still. His father stood helpless, a big man made small by the inability to fix the thing that was hurting his son. Caleb had been outside unloading supplies from the mare. He came in when he heard the screaming, stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. The thrashing child, the desperate parents. Alara calm but unable to get close enough to do her work. Then he walked to where Samuel was screaming and knelt down. The boy looked up at him. Caleb Hawthorne kneeling was still enormous. Shoulders like a barn door, hands like dinner plates. A face full of scars and weather lines and the kind of hard-lived history that usually makes children hide behind their mothers. Samuel should have screamed louder, should have recoiled from this massive, frightening stranger. Instead, he went quiet, not calm, not comforted, just surprised enough to stop screaming because this huge man had knelt down to his level and was looking at him with eyes that held no threat, no impatience, no adult frustration, just attention, just presence, just the steady, unhurried focus of a man who had all the time in the world and intended to spend it right here. Samuel. Caleb's voice was low, gentle, so different from the gravel and granite Alara was accustomed to that she almost did not recognize it. My name's Caleb. I got hurt a while back too. A wolf bit my leg, tore it right open, hurt so bad I thought I was going to die. Samuel's eyes were wide, wet, fixed on Caleb's face. A real wolf. A real wolf, big gray one. Meanest animal on this mountain. Caleb held up his hand, showing the scars across his knuckles. I fought him. Won. But not before he got me good. Were you scared? Terrified. Thought I was done for. Caleb leaned closer as if sharing a secret. But then Miss Alara came. She's the one standing right there. She fixed me up, sewed my leg back together. She has these magic hands, Samuel. I've seen her do things that the best doctors in Philadelphia couldn't do. And right now, she needs to fix your arm the same way she fixed my leg. But she can only do it if you hold real still. It hurts. I know it does. Hurts like nothing you've ever felt, but here's what we're going to do. Caleb extended his uninjured hand, palm up. You're going to hold my hand. Squeeze as hard as you can, and I'm going to count to 10. When I get to 10, it'll be over. Can you do that? Samuel looked at the massive hand being offered to him, looked at Caleb's face, looked at Alara, who was standing ready with her splinting materials, her face carefully composed to hide the emotion that was threatening to overwhelm her professional composure. The boy put his small hand in Caleb's. Okay, Samuel whispered. Count slow. Caleb counted, slow and steady, each number a marker on a road from pain to relief. 1, 2. Alara moved in. 3, 4. Her fingers found the brake, assessed the alignment. 5. Samuel's hand tightened on Caleb's. 6, 7. Alara set the bone with a quick, precise movement that made Samuel gasp but not scream. 8. She splinted the arm. 9. Wrapped it. 10. Open your eyes, Caleb said. Samuel opened them, looked at his arm. Wrapped, splinted, still hurting, but contained now, managed no longer the terrifying unknown that had made him scream. He looked at Caleb with the unguarded awe that only children and very honest adults are capable of. You're a hero. Something happened in Caleb's face. Alara watched it from across the room and felt her eyes burn and her throat tighten and her heart do something that she would later describe to Martha Henderson as cracking open like an egg, except instead of yolk, what came out was the rest of my life. Caleb looked at the boy, looked at Alara, looked back at the boy. No, he said. His voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with gravel and everything to do with a man discovering in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon in a makeshift clinic in a small mountain town that the hands he had used to kill could also be used to comfort a frightened child, and that the second use was infinitely, incomparably more valuable than the first. She's the hero, Samuel. I'm just lucky she saved me too. Word spread. The way word spreads in small communities through kitchen conversations and fence-line chats, and the quiet, efficient gossip networks that have existed in every town since the invention of towns. The mountain man helps at the clinic. Caleb Hawthorne held a child's hand while his arm was set. The bounty hunter who killed Garrett Slade with his bare hands sat with a little boy and counted to 10. People began to look at him differently. Not with fear, though the memory of his reputation persisted in the way memories do as a flavor that lingers long after the meal is finished. But alongside the fear, something else. Curiosity, reconsideration. The slow, cautious willingness of a community to revise its opinion when presented with evidence that contradicts the established narrative. The first man to openly change his mind was the blacksmith, a barrel-chested German named Heinrich, who had previously crossed the street when he saw Caleb coming. One morning, Heinrich walked into the clinic not for treatment, but to offer Caleb a job. Part-time work at the forge, doing the heavy lifting that Heinrich's aging back could no longer handle. Caleb looked at the man, looked at the forge, looked at his own hands and said yes. Others followed. The rancher in the valley asked Caleb to help with the barn raising. The postmaster asked him to ride the mail route when the regular carrier was sick. The boarding house owner asked him to fix her roof. Small things, ordinary things. The unremarkable transactions of daily life in a community where people need each other and know it. Each one was a thread connecting Caleb Hawthorne to the world he had abandoned. Each one was a stitch in a wound he had not believed could close. And Alara watched it happen with the professional satisfaction of a healer seeing her most difficult patient finally beginning to recover. Then the gunfighter came. He rode into Silver Creek on a hot afternoon in late spring, a young man of perhaps 22, with a new hat and a newer gun belt and the kind of restless, hungry energy that comes from wanting something you have not yet defined. His name was Billy Pruitt, and he had come all the way from Denver because he had heard that Caleb Hawthorne, the legendary bounty hunter, the man who had killed Garrett Slade with his bare hands, was living in Silver Creek. And Billy Pruitt wanted to be famous. And the fastest way to be famous in 1882 was to outdraw a man who was already famous. He stood in the middle of the main street, legs spread, hand hovering over his holstered pistol, and shouted, "Hawthorne, Caleb, Hawthorne, come out and face me like a man, or are you too busy playing nursemaid to hide behind a woman's skirts?" The street emptied, doors closed, shutters banged shut. Martha Henderson pulled 2 children inside her store and locked the door. The blacksmith set down his hammer. Edgar Finn, sitting on the porch of the boarding house with a cup of coffee he would never finish, went very still. Caleb walked out of the clinic. He was unarmed. No gun belt, no rifle, no knife. Just a man in a work shirt with his sleeves rolled up, showing forearms that were thick with muscle and marked with scars. He walked to the edge of the porch and stopped. Looked at Billy Pruitt, the way a man looks at something that reminds him of himself at an age when he was too young to know better. "I don't fight anymore," Caleb said. "Coward." Billy's hand twitched over his gun. "The great Caleb Hawthorne is nothing but a coward. hiding up on a mountain, hiding behind a woman, too scared to face a real man. If that's what you need to believe, draw your weapon. Don't have one. This was not what Billy had expected. He had rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times on the ride from Denver. The confrontation, the exchange of threats, the draw, the shot, the fame. In none of those rehearsals had his opponent walked out unarmed and spoken to him in a voice that sounded more tired than afraid. "I've got a patient inside," Caleb said. "A rancher's wife with a fever that won't break. My wife is treating her, and she needs my help. So if you're going to shoot me, do it now. Otherwise, step aside so I can go help someone live instead of helping someone die." Billy Pruitt stood in the middle of that dusty street with his hand on his gun and his heart hammering and his fame evaporating in the spring sunshine. He was facing an unarmed man who was not afraid, not posturing, not playing a game. An unarmed man who simply had better things to do. The seconds stretched, the wind blew dust along the street, a horse somewhere stamped and snorted. Billy's hand dropped from his gun, his shoulders fell. He stood there for a moment longer, confused and diminished, a young man suddenly aware that the thing he had been chasing was not worth the catching. Then he turned, walked to his horse mounted, and rode away without another word. Caleb went back inside to help with the rancher's wife. Alara, who had watched the entire exchange through the clinic window with her heart in her throat and her hands gripping the windowsill hard enough to leave marks, did not say anything when he came back in. She did not need to. She simply handed him the fresh bandages she had been preparing, and they worked side by side in the quiet efficiency that had become their shared language, the language of two people who have chosen the same life and do not need to explain to each other why. That night on the porch of the cabin, with the stars so thick above them that the sky looked like it was made of light, Ilara told Caleb about the child growing inside her. She had known for 2 weeks, had been waiting for the right moment, which is another way of saying she had been afraid. Not of the child, not of motherhood. Afraid that the news would send Caleb back into himself, back behind the walls she had spent weeks dismantling, because a child meant a future, and a future meant hope, and hope was the thing Caleb Hawthorne had spent 3 years trying to kill. She need not have worried. Caleb sat very still when she told him. He looked at her face, looked at her belly still flat beneath her dress, looked at his own hands resting on his knees, hands that had killed men, hands that had held a dying brother, hands that had just this afternoon held a frightened boy's hand while his arm was set. "A child," he said. "A child," Alara confirmed. He stood up. She thought for one terrible moment that he was going to walk away down the steps into the darkness back to the mountain and the silence and the grave he had dug for himself. Instead, he turned to the cabin, went inside, and came back carrying the cedar chest that had lived beneath his bed since before Laura arrived. He set it on the porch between them, took the key from the chain around his neck, the chain she had noticed but never asked about, opened the lock. Inside were Thomas's things, the hat, the knife, the letters, the rock collection leather pouch heavy with stones from a dozen territories, the photograph of 2 young brothers smiling. Caleb lifted the photograph, held it in the starlight. "I'm going to build a room," he said, "for the baby, next to ours, cedar walls like this chest, so the whole room smells like the trees Thomas used to climb." He looked at Alara, and she saw in his eyes the thing she had been looking for since the day she arrived on this mountain with a suitcase and a prayer. Not the predator, not the hermit, not the bounty hunter or the mountain man or the wounded bear. A father. He was going to be a father. And the knowledge of it was not a burden or a trap or a cage. It was a key. The key to the last locked room inside him. The room where he had kept the belief that he was capable of protecting someone, of keeping someone safe, of being more than the man who had failed his brother in a cave. Thomas would have loved this, Caleb said. His voice was rough, rougher than gravel, rougher than anything Alara had heard from him, including the sounds he had made when she was pulling catgut thread through his torn leg. He would have been the worst uncle in history. Spoiled the kid rotten, taught them every bad habit in the book. "Tell me about him," Alara said. "Tell me everything. I want our child to know their uncle." And Caleb talked, sat on the porch of the cabin he had built to die in, and talked about his brother until the stars moved across the sky and the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern peaks. He told her every story, every memory, every ridiculous rock-collecting adventure, and every terrible joke. He talked until his voice gave out, and then he talked some more, and Alara listened to all of it, held all of it, because that was what love was in the end. Not the grand gestures or the dramatic rescues or the moments of crisis that test the limits of what a person can endure. Love was sitting on a porch in the dark and holding someone's story in your hands and telling them through your listening that nothing they have lived through has to be carried alone ever again. Spring turned to summer. The cabin grew. Caleb built the baby's room with cedar walls that made the whole space smell of forest. He built a cradle from a single piece of wood carved with the patience and attention to detail of a man making something holy. He built a rocking chair for Alara to sit in during the nights to come when the baby would need feeding and holding, and the kind of constant, exhausting, magnificent attention that new life demands. The clinic prospered. Alara's reputation spread beyond Silver Creek to ranches and mining camps throughout the valley. People rode for hours to see her, and more often than not, they found a large, quiet man at her side, handing her instruments, holding patients steady, speaking in a voice so gentle that it seemed to belong to a different person than the one described in the old stories about the bounty hunter Caleb Hawthorne. The letter from Pemberton never led to anything more. No more lawyers arrived. No more riders in bowler hats. Whether Pemberton had given up or simply redirected his cruelty elsewhere, Alara did not know and tried not to care. She had what she needed: a home, a husband, a child coming, a life she had built with her own hands in a place she had chosen with her own will, beside a man she had saved and who had saved her in return. On a warm evening in August, with the aspens turning gold on the lower slopes and the creek running clear and cold through the valley, Caleb sat on the porch steps and watched the sunset paint the mountains in colors that should not have existed outside of dreams. Alara came out and sat beside him, lowered herself carefully, one hand on her growing belly, leaned her head against his shoulder. "Any regrets?" she asked. The same question she asked him every evening, a ritual, now a call and response that had become part of the grammar of their shared life. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked at the mountains, the sky, the valley where Silver Creek sat like a handful of houses someone had scattered along a stream. He looked at the porch rail he had built with his own hands, the cradle visible through the window, the woman beside him whose head fit perfectly against his shoulder, whose presence had turned a prison into a home. "One," he said. Alara lifted her head, looked at him. "I wish the wolf had bitten me sooner." A smile, real and warm and full, the smile of a man who has discovered, after nearly half a century of living, that there are better things to do with a life than survive it. "You might have found me a year earlier." Alara laughed. The sound carried across the porch and out into the evening air and over the mountains, and if there had been anyone on the trail below to hear it, they would have stopped and listened, because it was the kind of laugh that makes the world seem for a moment like a place worth the trouble of living in. She took his hand, placed it on her belly. The baby kicked against his palm, a small, insistent pressure, a heartbeat communicating through flesh and fabric. "Here I am coming, I am real." Caleb Hawthorne, who had climbed a mountain to die alone, felt his child move beneath his hand and understood at last the thing that Alara had been trying to teach him since the day she walked through his door, uninvited, and refused to leave. That the deepest wounds are not the ones cut into flesh. They are the scars on hearts that have been told they are unworthy of love. The damage to souls convinced they are beyond saving. That true healing is not about suturing skin or setting bones or drawing poison from a wound. It is about seeing someone at their worst and choosing to stay. It is about offering a second chance when the world says there are none. It is about having the courage to choose mercy over vengeance, hope over despair, love over the long, cold safety of being alone. And it is about the quiet, stubborn, unreasonable decision to keep believing that people can change, that the hunter can become the healer, that the cabin on the mountain can become a home, that two broken people can hold each other's pieces and make something whole. Caleb Hawthorne arrived at that cabin carrying the weight of his brother's death and the belief that he deserved nothing better than solitude and silence and the slow grinding erosion of a life lived without purpose. Alara Whitfield arrived at that cabin carrying a suitcase full of medical supplies and the kind of stubbornness that moves mountains more reliably than dynamite. What they built together was not perfect. It was not easy. It was marked by the scars they both carried and shaped by the pain they had both survived. But it was real. It was theirs. And it was in its own imperfect, hard-won, beautiful way enough. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you gave someone a second chance, not a stranger in a story? Someone in your own life, someone who had made mistakes, who had hurt people, who had retreated behind walls of their own making and declared themselves beyond reaching. And when was the last time someone gave you one? Because that is what this story is really about, not gunfighters in mountain cabins and wolves in weddings. It is about the moment when one person looks at another and sees past the reputation, past the scars, past the things they have done, and the things done to them, the human being underneath. The person who is still capable of change, still worthy of love, still reachable, if only someone has the courage to reach. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And if you know someone who is carrying something heavy in silence, someone who has climbed their own mountain and locked their own door, share this with them. Sometimes a story is the nudge a person needs to believe they deserve their own second chance. Tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you live? I read every single one. And subscribe so you do not miss the next story. Because one honest choice turned a cabin on a mountain from a prison into a home. One stubborn woman with a suitcase turned a man who wanted to die into a man who wanted to live. And it is never too late to choose a better way forward.